7 o'clock, you're watching a Sky News special programme. War in Ukraine, Putin's next move. Coming up, we'll get the latest on the ground and ask whether President Putin can claim any kind of success so far. We'll be looking at the changing Russian strategy after the focus shifted to the Donbass following the failure to take Kiev. As the UN Secretary-General visits Moscow, we'll discuss the West's role in the war and what the conflict means for the future of NATO. And we'll be asking what a peace settlement could look like and how this war might end. Welcome to a Sky News special programme, War in Ukraine, Putin's next move. In the next hour, we'll be joined by experts from the West and Russia to analyse the war so far, where it could go next, and crucially, how it might end. Well, let's introduce then our panel for this evening. Joining us from Moscow, Sergei Markov, Director of the Institute of Political Studies, who's a former member of the Russian Parliament and a former spokesman for President Putin. Also in Moscow, journalist and political analyst Dmitry Babich. From Berlin, we're joined by Wolfgang Richter, a retired colonel in the German army and military expert at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. And here in Westminster, Louise Jones, former officer in the British Army Intelligence Corps and head of intelligence at Mackenzie Intelligence Services. So that's our panel. But let's begin by reminding ourselves how the Russian campaign has evolved since it began more than 2 months ago now, and take a look at the current situation on the ground in Ukraine. Our defence and security analyst, Professor Michael Clark, is at the screen.
This war began on the 24th of February with the Russian invasion. And the original idea was that it would all be over by the 8th of March. So this was phase one of a three-phase war. The first phase was where the Russians were going to capture Kiev within the first 48 or 72 hours, grab the government and deal with any unrest elsewhere by the 8th of March. It was a complete and utter failure. So then they moved to phase two. And phase two was transforming this sort of arrangement to more of a maneuverist warfare. And so what they tried to do in the maneuver phase was to surround the cities, to actually put Chernihiv and Sumy and Kharkiv and Mariupol, of course, under pressure. But they found that they really couldn't do that very easily because they didn't really have enough troops to do it. They didn't really have the right equipment to do it. So they were left outside the cities just bombarding civilian areas. That wasn't getting them very far. They did take Kherson, which was the only city that this second phase of the war actually gave them. That wasn't going very well. So the third phase of the war began about 2 weeks ago, and the Russians said, really, we didn't intend to do any of that. All of that was just preparation for the fact that we really wanted to consolidate territory in the Donbass and in the land bridge towards the Crimea. And so this third phase of the war is the phase that we're in now, where they've redeployed the forces that were beaten, quite badly beaten, around Kiev, around the outside of the clock, to re-engage in this big offensive in the Donbass. And so that's where we are today, phase three of the war, which will be the most critical phase for the next few months. And what this is based on is drawing a famous line that I keep talking about between Kharkiv and Mariupol to close this salient, this big salient, which will include about 40% of Ukrainian forces on the wrong side of the salient, to surround them. That's quite a big thing to do. And so immediately what the Russians are trying to do is to draw a smaller line from Izium, they're fighting very hard south of Izium, down to Donetsk, and catch most of the Ukrainian forces that they're interested in that part of the territory. Meanwhile, in Kherson, quite a lot is going on there. The Russians are pushing again in Kherson because there are rumours that maybe they will try to have a referendum in Kherson on the 1st of May in order to show that the citizens of Kherson really want to join the Russian Federation. So that's the situation as is at the moment. Still very fluid, still everything to play for.
Professor Michael Clark there with his analysis. So clearly the invasion has not gone according to plan for the Kremlin, particularly in the first phase of the campaign, as Michael Clark was describing there. So can President Putin claim any degree of success in the war so far? Let's talk to our panel then. And starting with you, Louise Jones. I mean, clearly at the moment, it's a story of failures, quite spectacular failures in the north and more limited gains in the south and the east.
Yeah, so it was very clear from the beginning that Russia's grand aim was to try and take Kiev, was to remove the government of President Zelensky, install a regime that is much more favourable to them. As we've seen, they never even really got close to being able to achieve that aim, and they've really had to pull out of that northern region completely. They have restated their aims as saying, oh, well, OK, perhaps all we ever wanted was to consolidate control in the Donbass. Perhaps we'll look at trying to take Odessa. And frankly, these are quite ambitious aims when you look at the capability and capacity of the Russian forces now. So really, I think we're just going to see these aims change over the next few months and just become very much more limited in what they're trying to achieve.
OK, let's bring in some voices from Moscow. Sergei Markov, would you go along with that? I mean, clearly, the campaign as planned for all those months did not work initially.
Yeah, that's right. It's absolutely clear. First plan was that Russian troops will move to the biggest city, as Kyiv, Kharkov, Chernihiv, Sumy, and others. And as a result, the Ukrainian government could leave those cities, and it could be a vacuum of power. And this vacuum of power will be taken by anti-fascist pro-Russian political forces. And as a result, this is kind of new government of Ukraine will claim that negotiation with Russia and starting the process of denazification, demilitarization.
OK, I mean, that's your analysis. But, you know, we're asking why Russia, with all its huge military might, failed to take Kiev. It's the military situation I want to concentrate on. Dmitry Babich, was there some kind of thinking in the Kremlin that Ukraine would rapidly capitulate and indeed welcome Russian forces?
Well, maybe a part of the Russian leadership had these illusions, but I don't think President Putin himself had them. And I'm not sure that the plan was exactly what Professor Michael Clark described. At least I never heard any Russian generals, I never saw any documents which would indicate that the plan was to take Kiev in 3 days or 4 days. No, everyone understood that it was going to be a much longer, more difficult operation. Because let me remind you, the war did not start on the February 24th. The war had been going on for 8 years. And the Russians know very well that the Ukrainian army has some very capable units that have been fighting in Donbass. And look, you know, the version that Putin has been pushing, that the Russian invasion kind of prevented Ukrainian attack against Donbass, this version is given some meat by the fact that the Russian army so far has not been able to secure Donetsk and Lugansk from bombardments.
Get on to that in a moment or two.
The most capable units which are located right next to Donetsk since 2014.
Okay. I want to get your analysis, General Richter, on the failure of Russian forces in the north, particularly around Kiev and indeed other cities. This idea of encirclement and a rapid failure by Ukraine. It just didn't transpire. Why did Russia think that might happen?
I think the failure started with the wrong assessment on the top leadership. If you have the assessment that things would turn out to be very similar to the operations in 2014, then you, of course, fail to achieve anything because you think, again, the Ukrainian forces would not be in a position to fight strongly. Parts of the Ukrainian army, particularly the Ukrainian Black Sea Fleet, in 2014 changed sides, and some others didn't want to fight. So the brunt of the fighting rested on the volunteer battalions. And this situation is totally different. Ukraine has now developed a kind of homogeneity that is historical. There is a clear national identity of Ukraine, and that is what President Putin underestimated. He even denied this identity. And if you start with that assessment from top down, you make all the mistakes that were made. That means you are not prepared for real intensive fighting. You have 6 parallel axes of advance emphasis. And then you have failures of logistical lines of communication. and even on the tactical level, the skills to fight a combined arms battle were not so developed.
Okay. I just want to continue on what you described there, Wolfgang Richter, about the failures of analysis by the Kremlin before they started the war, this phase of the war. Louise Jones, I mean, does that fundamentally come down to intelligence failures? We do hear that there is, from what we can tell, disquiet within the Kremlin about the military intelligence that they were getting before they launched the attack, particularly on Kiev.
Yeah, I think that's very clear. So, you know, it's easy to characterise sometimes the Kremlin as, you know, information is not being passed between those who need to know and analysed properly. And I think the facts have borne themselves out, you know. So really in the Kremlin, are people telling the truth, even when it's not what the president wants to hear? Clearly they're not. You know, we've just recently heard that, oh, well, their plan was not to take Kiev in 3 days. We never expected to take Kiev so far. So that kind of implies, well, what was the plan then? Was it to send thousands of troops to nearby Kiev, be there for a couple of weeks, lose thousands of troops, and then withdraw, and on the way back, dig up a load of radioactive earth around Chernobyl? Was that the plan? Appears to be what we're hearing. That was what the intelligence led them to do. A few questions here.
Well, let's put them to Sergei Markov. First of all, Sergei Markov, does President Putin get told what he wants to hear, or does he get told the plain truth about the failures?
It's absolutely clear that first stage have been not so much successful because it's clear that Russian troops had to withdraw Kiev, Chernihiv and Sumy regions. And now, as a result, Russia had to change its military and political strategy. The army is much more consolidated than our Russian political intelligence service, I think, expected. And Russia now military effort will concentrate exactly in Donbass area, first of all, to surround and then to crush Ukrainian army. In the first stage, it was no rocket missiles strikes over the headquarters of Ukrainian army, and was on contrary appeal of Vladimir Putin to the generals of the Ukrainian army to take power in their hands and then to come to some kind of agreement with Russia. But it was absolutely not successful. Now we have efficiently changed our strategy and not to have brotherhood with Ukrainian army, but to have a real war with Ukrainian army and to crush it.
Okay.
And how it will be effective, of course, we don't know. The ground, the war on the ground will show us.
All right, we're going to get on to the next phase of the Russian strategy in a moment or two. But Dmitry Babich, that loss of troops, 15, 20,000 we hear dead, tanks, aircraft, other military equipment. I mean, it's looking like a colossal failure which will affect the next phase of the campaign.
I don't believe your figure is correct. 15,000 is too much. You know, I have personal connections with several commanders on the ground.
What do you hear?
And they all report that the losses were like from 5 to 7% of the soldiers in their units.
Hold on, I'm just doing the maths. We're hearing 190,000, so 7% of 190,000 is just under, what, 14,000, 13,000 or so?
Well, first, the combat units, they are not all these 150,000 who are concentrated on the border. Also take into account the fact that there are logistical support troops. No, I think that the real figure is, of course, not 15,000, although, yes, it is counted in thousands. Talking about what Louise Jones said, I think that Putin consulted with very few people before starting this operation, because it is my not only impression, but I'm almost sure that, for example, Foreign Minister Lavrov was not informed about this operation, because on the eve of the operation, when the Security Council met and he was asked to provide his advice, Lavrov said, okay, all of our propositions to the Western countries were turned down, We are being kind of rejected by NATO, but I think this work should continue. It makes sense to continue working on the diplomatic routes. If Lavrov had known that in 2 days the invasion would begin, he of course would not have uttered these words. So at least until 12 or I don't know, 20 hours before the operation, he was not informed about it, which means that Putin kept this information to a very close circle of his advisors. As for him not being told the truth, I can tell you why the mood in Russia was the way you described it. The problem is that we have hundreds of thousands, almost millions immigrants from Ukraine who are very angry with the Ukrainian government, with Mr. Poroshenko and later with Mr. Zelensky. And they have access to television. So they kept saying that this regime is cruel, that it is corrupt, that it is weak. You know, right before the invasion, Zelensky shut down 2 of the country's main television channels. So dozens of journalists arrived in Moscow. And of course, in the public, the mood was that this regime is not only bad, but also weak.
So for whatever reason,
also people saw the cruelty of the Ukrainian army.
So for whatever reason, you're saying President Putin wasn't getting the correct picture. Listen, we're going to move on to the future strategy in a moment or two, but we must take a break. So if you all stay with us, we'll talk to Wolfgang Richter next. But you're watching Sky News tonight, and coming up, as I say, we'll be discussing the Russian strategy in Ukraine, how it's changed after that failure to capture the capital, Kiev.
The 60th anniversary is a critical milestone for us. It's a moment of reflection, looking at who we have been, how we have been, and where we are going. So for us, it's a matter of glorying in our culture, the things that have made us who we are, and this confluence of cultures and ethnicity that has woven itself into the Jamaican mosaic. And our forefathers saw it well by having a motto, out of many, one people. That's who Jamaica really is, out of many, one people. And we want to glory in that diversity and to show the world that our rich culture and our diverse offerings represent a little piece of them. We are a small island state, but the largest in the English-speaking Caribbean, characterized by very strong biodiversity, lush green vegetation, warm climate. We have a temperate climate running through the entire year. We have wonderful waterfalls and stalagmites and stalactites and food. Jamaica is known for its cuisine. Excellent food, delicious and delectable Jamaican cuisine.
We support communities to grow food in lost and unloved spaces across the city. So our main kind of driving force is to get people growing.
Welcome back. So when Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine a couple of months ago, ground forces crossed the border in the north, the east and the south. The plan was to surround and seize key Ukrainian cities, including Kiev, and bring about a swift surrender. Of course, it didn't work, and Russia's forces have withdrawn from the north to concentrate now on the eastern Donbass region. So to what extent is this new strategy from President Putin, which was brought about by a military failure? Let's explore the strategy now then. And Wolfgang Richter, first of all, what is the strategy as you see it? And can it work? It's clearly concentrating on the east, the Donbass, and the south.
Let me start with just a short comment to what Dmitry Babic has said when it comes to the failure of the phase one. He talked about the losses. If you speak about 10,000 or even 8,000 of people that died, soldiers that died in the war, then of course you have to add 3 times as much wounded. That means the loss is tremendous. It's 1/5 to 1/4 of the original force that started the operation. And the second, of course, there might be hundreds of thousands of immigrants who are not happy with the Ukrainian governments, but there are 40 million of Ukrainians who fight with an admirable spirit of resistance for their country, for the country, for the sovereignty and territorial integrity, and that should not be that you should have in mind when you talk about the second phase. Now, let me just look at the strategy. Obviously, Moscow learned some lessons from the phase one. It has now created a clear main emphasis of the battle. It has shortened the line of engagement. It has chosen a terrain that is more suited for the tactical battle groups, which dispose of a lot of armor and artillery, heavy fire, and are not so much suited for the fighting in cities. And that was maybe also the failure of the first phase. They got bogged down by city fighting and had a lot of losses there. So maybe the chances are a little bit better. The failures might not be repeated. On the other hand, we see the Ukrainian side with very surprising tactical skill that we're always in a position to also thwart armored attacks by small counterattacks, by anti-armor operations, etc. So I guess some terrain might be taken, but it is not clear yet, not at all, what the outcome of this phase will be.
OK, Sergei Markov, what do you see now as the altered Russian strategy to encircle the parts of the Ukrainian army that are based in the Donbass and extend the south all the way, perhaps even to Transnistria, take Odessa?
Of course, it's appeared to be that Ukrainian army more strong than we expected, but this Ukrainian army is very strange army, I would say. It's partly army of 21st century. It's an interesting combination. It's Russian soldier, because 90% of them speak Russian language, including fascist officer, because the level of Nazification of this officer corps during these 7 years appeared to be much more bigger than it was expected.
Well, they're fighting
before.
for democracy, Mr. Markov.
No democracy. Forget about this. What about Ukraine? It's fully puppet regime of United States of America. And I didn't finish. Russian soldier, fascist officer, and led by American general. Because most of the even formerly Ukrainian generals, they had been moderated by advisors from United States, from United States Army. So it's strong combination. Also, Ukrainian army...
Listen, I'm not going to listen to any more of this. So the Americans are training fascists who, some of them are Russians, to fight. I mean, honestly, we're discussing the strategy.
But it's true.
Yeah, OK. Louise Jones, in terms of the Russian strategy, the ambitions now, as we discussed in the first quarter of the programme, they failed in the north. That's some badly battered forces that they have to lick their wounds, and presumably some of them are going to be redeployed in the east. Can they do what they want to do?
So it's very difficult to reconstitute badly damaged units and then redeploy them in a short amount of time. So they're really going to struggle to bring really much of that manpower to bear. The forces that they have in the southeast, they'll also struggle to really mount any kind of major offensive because they will have to be very focused on holding the ground that they want. The Ukraine is obviously so welcoming of the Russians that the Russians won't be able to just leave the city. They'll have to leave a large proportion of their forces behind. And, the idea that, there's President Zelensky was some sort of puppet is just ridiculous. He was elected, on a very clear pro-peace platform.
I just address that point. I mean, to be fair to Sergei Markov, clearly, and we're going to get onto it more in another part of the programme, NATO forces, Americans amongst them, British, Canadians, others, have been training the Ukrainians. No doubt about that.
Yeah, and NATO, the US, the UK, they're training forces all around the world. They're from, training anti-poaching operations in Africa. Are we saying when they train anti-poachers, that's some sort of pro-Nazi training regime? Of course not. And I think, flattering Russia a little bit here, America's been very clear about the focuses of its foreign policy is very much focused on Asia-Pacific. The idea that they're, spinning some sort of game in Ukraine purely aimed at Russia, I think Russia's flattering itself there.
OK, Dmitry Babich, I just want to stick with the military side of this discussion. And what does President Putin want to achieve now? Because this will set us up for another part of the discussion about what might end this conflict. So how much territory do you think he wants?
You cannot talk here about military affairs without talking about politics and ideology, because it is a very ideological war. It is a very political war. And I will only give you facts. So on the military side, I think the plan is to defeat the professional part of the Ukrainian army, the part that can use the sophisticated weapons provided by NATO. You know that it was announced today in Ramstein that NATO already provided, since the beginning of the Russian invasion, as you call it, NATO provided $5 billion worth of military equipment to Ukraine. And probably more, because the German chancellor admitted that there were a lot of secret shipments that were not mentioned anywhere.
But you make it sound as if that's the wrong thing to do. Ukraine is a sovereign nation which has been invaded by its much, much bigger neighbour.
Well, there are many conflicts in the world, and usually the ethics is not to provide weapons so that not to extinguish the fire with gasoline. What the West is doing right now is exactly extinguishing the fire with gasoline. I'm sorry, it's absolutely clear that President Biden and the European leaders want this war to continue because they encourage Mr. Zelensky to change his position at the negotiating table. First, in the first day, he talked about neutrality. He talked about agreeing not to make Ukraine a part of NATO. Then he dropped all of these promises, obviously after talks with Western leaders. Talking about, you said, what does Russia want? Basically, the reason why Russia was successful in the East and in the South is very simple. These are Russian-speaking regions, and Russian language was discriminated against.
Well, Russia seems to be killing an awful lot of Russian-speaking citizens who, you say, want to be part of Russia. What about the thousands of people being bombarded and massacred in Mariupol?
I admire your way of moderating this discussion. When you hear something that goes against your line, you just repeat what you said before.
Against my line? It's the facts, Mr. Babich. It's the facts.
Yeah, I will tell you the facts. I will tell you the facts. Unfortunately, when you fight a very aggressive nationalistic regime, such as the regime of Saddam Hussein, for example, you kill a lot of people whom you are trying to liberate. This is what the Americans and the British did in many places in the last...
Well, at least you're being honest. Now the Russians are doing it. OK, we're going to take another break. You'll get plenty more time to make your points later on in this programme. It's Sky News Tonight, and coming up, as the UN Secretary-General visits President Putin in Moscow, we'll be discussing the West's role in this war.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Now then, the Secretary-General of the United Nations has called for a ceasefire in Ukraine as soon as possible. During a visit to Moscow for talks with President Putin, Antonio Guterres said humanitarian corridors must be set up to get people out of Mariupol, calling the port city a crisis within a crisis. But President Putin told Mr. Guterres that it's Ukraine that's blocking the evacuation of civilians from Mariupol. Our Moscow correspondent Diana Magnay reports.
Vladimir Putin taking his seat at the long table with the UN Secretary-General at the other end. It evolved fast into a debate on international law, but Antonio Guterres made it clear how he views Russia's special military operation.
We strongly believe that the violation of the territorial integrity of any country fully contradicts the UN Charter. And we are deeply concerned in connection with what's happening now. And we believe that there was an invasion into the territory of Ukraine.
Mr. Guterres had already met with Russia's foreign minister and goes on next to Kyiv this Thursday. His mission, he says, to ensure humanitarian corridors out of Mariupol. But Vladimir Putin insisted that that was happening already.
Вы говорите, что гуманитарные коридоры России не действуют. Господин генеральный секретарь, вас ввели в заблуждение. Эти коридоры действуют. Из Мариуполя вышло при нашем содействии свыше 100 тысяч человек. 130, по-моему, или 140 тысяч человек вышло. И они могут ехать куда угодно.
The UN Secretary-General was criticised for this trip, especially for coming to Moscow first. Volodymyr Zelensky asking what he would see here. There are no corpses scattered along Kutuzovsky Prospect, he said, which is the road that I'm on now. The measure of how successful this trip has been will be whether Mr. Guterres has managed to organise a ceasefire in some kind of humanitarian corridor, which the people of Mariupol, and especially those in the Azovstal steelworks, feel that they can trust. At the Ramstein air base in Germany, NATO defence ministers met to discuss further military aid to Ukraine on top of the $5 billion already pledged, with Germany adding 50 Gepard anti-aircraft tanks to the mix.
Ukraine clearly believes that it can win, and so does everyone here. We have much more to do. Ukraine needs our help to win today, and they will still need our help when the war is over.
And here, a reminder of why this must end. Drone footage provided by the self-proclaimed Luhansk People's Republic, showing what's left of a village once on the Ukrainian side of the line of contact, now under Russian control. Absolute devastation, not a single building intact. Just a special military operation, Russia calls this, but it comes at a terrible cost. Diana Magnay, Sky News, Moscow.
So let's then discuss the West's role in this conflict and what the war could mean for the future of the NATO military alliance. Colonel Richter, first of all, I mean, there's no doubt that NATO is deeply involved in this conflict and going to get further involved, even if it's only by the supply of military equipment. And given your background, can I ask you a specific question, first of all? Is Germany, in your view, doing enough, even with the announcement today of the supply of those tanks?
I think Germany is doing what other NATO nations are also doing. There is no difference because Germany sent anti-aircraft and anti-tank weapons and other goods, and now we are discussing heavier weapons. The real point here is that Germany wants to go together with other allies and not have a special role in that. And when it comes to the latest development, then indeed one can assess that Ukrainians need air cover and they need anti-aircraft weapons and they need anti-armor. That's the reason why now we discuss also the delivery of so-called anti-aircraft tank Gepard systems, which will have to undergo some time, of course, before they are combat ready, and we have to think about training, etc., etc. But
and could you see that training? Sorry to interrupt, Colonel Richter, but could you see that training ultimately taking place on Ukrainian soil? NATO forces crossing that border.
No, not at all. There's a clear firewall. NATO, all NATO states have clearly said we will not get involved in military operations in Ukraine. But we should not forget that Ukraine is the sovereign country that was attacked by another country with a superior army. And Ukraine has all the right to defend itself and its sovereignty and territorial integrity. And that is, of course, in line with international law, with Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations. And all other states have, of course, the right to support a nation that fights for independence. But if I may, I want to make a remark on something which I cannot let go this way. First, there is a myth which was portrayed here by my Russian colleagues of this fascist government in Kiev. President Zelensky was democratically elected. We have a multi-party system. The right-wing nationalist parties have got less than 2.5% in the last election, so we should not distort the facts here. And 40 million of population that show an admirable resistance spirit tell another story, and that includes, of course, Russian speakers. And 470 advisors that were indeed there in the area of Lviv did not create the spirit of the whole population that is supporting the army, but they could only maybe train weapons or some other skills. So Russia underestimated the national identity and homogeneity of the Ukrainian nation. And this is a basic mistake which is still there, and it was also the reason maybe for the failure. And to the Western role, the Western role was not to create the war or to want the war. No, the opposite was true. The Western statesmen warned before of the war. For example, Federal Chancellor Scholz, shortly before the war started, warned of starting the war, and said also clearly that NATO accession of Ukraine is not on the agenda.
Yes, we remember that.
That is a reality.
Remember the Chancellor's and the Chancellor's visit to Moscow. Dmitry Babich, just on this issue of NATO, Foreign Minister Lavrov said that Russia is now fighting a proxy war against NATO because of this huge supply of armaments, and now regards those supply lines as legitimate targets.
Well, if Wolfgang Richter was allowed to speak for more than 1 minute, I will also speak a little more than 1 minute. Yes, well, since these weapons are coming to the front line, since they will be used against Russian soldiers, like in any war, of course, Russia may hit some targets on the territory of Ukraine, not outside, destroying these weapons. Some of them may be dangerous for Europe too. I mean, CNN reported that the US has no idea where all the Stinger missiles that they supplied to Ukraine went. Let me remind you what happened to Stinger missiles that the United States sent to Afghanistan. They became very dangerous weapons in the hands of the terrorists. So it is a huge issue. Who is flooding Ukraine with weapons and for what purpose? I think it will be a danger for everyone, including European countries. As for democracy in Ukraine, in 2010, President Yanukovych was legally elected.
I just want to stick to the
and
issue.
He was ousted. Are you already interrupting?
You can speak, but we're talking about NATO now.
Rebellion. He was ousted by violent rebellion, and he was voted in power by people from the east and from the south of Ukraine, from those regions which are now, yes, welcoming Russian troops. As for persecution of opposition in Ukraine, the leader of the biggest opposition party was first put under house arrest by Mr. Zelensky, and now Mr. Zelensky wants to exchange him as a prisoner of war with Russians. This is the way he treats his opposition.
And Russia has kidnapped elected officials from parts of Ukraine that it has taken. On the issue of NATO, Sergei Markov.
Tell me the names.
On the issue of NATO, one of the original aims, the continuing aim of Russia is, of course, to keep NATO at bay, to stop its eastward expansion. It seems that it's failed in that it's backfired, that Russia wanted less NATO. Now it's getting more of it. We're seeing the Finns, the Swedes, of course, the Ukrainians and others wanting to join NATO.
Of course, it's negative for Russia if Sweden and Finland will give up their neutrality and will join NATO. It will increase NATO's threat to Russia. And of course, we see consolidation of NATO right now. And one of the possibilities which we regard as possible, the concept of global NATO will be implemented. As a result, probably Japan, South Korea, and Australia also will join NATO. Of course, it also will lead to the increasing threat to not only to the Russia, but to the China. But it's not it's what we expected. We're talking about increasing of aggressiveness of NATO. It's exactly what we could see in Ukraine. But same time, NATO tried to ignore concern about security of such countries like Russia and China. And you may know that one of the main goals of Russian operation is denazification of Ukraine.
Right.
And when you
whatever that may be.
If you interrupted my point,
I'm only interrupting you because you've said it before, and you've said it again and again and again. And we've heard it. We've given you your time to say that, and we're not going to discuss that anymore because we are discussing NATO. And Louise Jones, last thought. Give me your take on how NATO's handling this. I mean, in terms of its cohesion, because clearly there are stresses and strains. Of course, there are.
Yeah, well, first off, I think it's a bit disingenuous to talk about the expansion of NATO. NATO didn't expand. Applying for membership became more popular. I wonder why that would be. Why would people want to join such a defensive organisation? And I don't think we've ever seen NATO so unified. You know, even when you look back to the beginnings of the Iraq and Afghanistan conflict, they weren't nearly as unified as this. And not only, you know, with the election of Macron, obviously a vote there by the French public for the more pro-Ukrainian candidate. And then you've seen Germany now taking steps that you'd never have imagined them taking. And they've only taken these as a direct result of Russians' actions in Ukraine. So great master strategy again there. And Finland and Sweden, for a very long time, have never even countenanced joining NATO. So for them, it looks like it's very likely that it will go ahead now. And again, you know, this isn't NATO expanding. NATO hasn't threatened Finland or Sweden in any way. They've just clearly identified that there is now a threat from their large neighbour, and NATO is the way to guarantee that. If you're a democratic nation that wants the democratic will of your elections to be respected, the best way to do that is to have NATO guaranteeing it.
OK, time to move on. You're watching a Sky News Tonight special programme on Ukraine. Coming up, we're going to be asking what a peace settlement between Russia and Ukraine could look like and how this war, and perhaps when, will it end?
I'm David Blevins, and I'm Sky's senior Ireland correspondent. I'm based in Belfast, a city transformed by peace, but still struggling with its past. Politically, the two sides are as far apart as ever, and it's over that question of who has sovereignty in Northern Ireland, the very issue that's been the source of tension here for generations. It takes 60 minutes to cross the Irish Sea. It took the British monarchy a century. I've spent 25 years reporting the journey from conflict to peace.
The political parties of Northern Ireland have reached agreement.
We help you understand the world with us.
Today, we have reached an agreement with the Conservative Party on support for government in Parliament.
We already know what the government gets out of this deal. What exactly does the DUP get out of it? Well, £1.5 billion. Welcome to Winterfell. It's an iconic location in this globally acclaimed drama. Ophelia was the most powerful hurricane this far east in the Atlantic on record. You can't live in a place like this and not appreciate the environment.
Welcome back. In the final part of tonight's programme, we're going to discuss the potential for a peace settlement between Russia and Ukraine and how this war could end. Speaking to Sky News today, the UK Armed Forces Minister said that President Putin is making unsound military decisions, such as his desire to declare some kind of victory by the 9th of May. That's the day that Russia marks the end of the Second World War, Victory Day. So how close is Russia to seizing the Donbass in eastern Ukraine? Would that be a satisfactory outcome for Vladimir Putin? And would Ukraine, of course, accept that outcome and perhaps the permanent loss of Crimea if it brought about peace? Well, let's discuss that. First of all, Sergei Markov, is the 9th of May some kind of deadline for President Putin?
It's, this war, not war for the territories. Russia has a lot of territories, you may know, and Russia has a lot of population, and Russia doesn't need more territories, but Russia needs to get away its threat. And Russia regard the threat from Ukrainian territory is coming from United States of America and NATO, which, from our point of view, occupy Ukraine politically, and it's created a zone puppet regime. It's one threat which Russia will be insisted to take out. And we believe, secondly, that artificially using terror, this puppet regime make anti-Russia from Ukraine, make all Ukrainians to hate Russia and to prohibit, by the way, Russian language, which is language of the 70% of population. And third, and also very important, already claim denazification. We absolutely doesn't like when this aggressive regime exists on our border. So if this Russian concern will be taken into account by Western coalitions,
the question was about something to Russia's satisfaction being achieved by May the 9th. Clearly, you're saying it can't happen given the scale of that ambition. Dmitry Babich, do you see something more limited being accepted by Russia fairly soon in terms of autonomous regions, perhaps in and around the Donbass and the permanent secession of Crimea?
Well, I think everything will depend on the outcome of the battle in Donbass. Will Russia be able to negotiate from the position of strength? Because the Ukrainian delegation at the talks, which first took place in Belarus, then they took place in Istanbul, the Ukrainian delegation changed its stance several times. So obviously, in order to achieve, get something from them, you need to negotiate from the position of strength. That is the position of President Putin. And he will not meet Zelensky until there are some documents signed and prepared, and he will only meet Zelensky if they sit over the prepared paper. What that paper is going to be, I think no one knows, even in Russia, because just like with Germany in 1945, we don't know, and the Allies didn't know what kind of regime would spring up there. Would it be a unified country or would it be a split country? Obviously, Russia will continue recognizing the independence of these two people's republics, Donetsk and Lugansk. Will they join Russia is an open question. Okay. I agree with Sergei Markov that Russia does not need that territory. But obviously, if the Ukrainian army is defeated, then maybe Russia may try to negotiate more, some kind of status for Kherson.
I'm sorry, we're coming towards the end of the programme, but Dmitry Babich, you make a very valid point there, Wolfgang Richter, that ultimately the settlement of any conflict depends about what happens on the battlefield, Wolfgang Richter. So the next few weeks and months are going to be critical.
Absolutely, you are right. The next few months are critical because the Russian forces are far stretched at the moment. If I look at all the ground forces available, including paratroopers and Marines, and I found that almost 2/3 of all Russian troops are engaged in Ukraine. And if you see the long borderlines of Russia, there are other hotspots, there are other trouble areas. They cannot just take the reserves out of these areas, be it the Caucasus, the Central Asian part, or the protection of fleet stations like Murmansk, etc., which are important for nuclear issues. And even in the Far East, you see certain developments that are not to the desire of the Russian leadership. So the Russian forces are stretched. For them, it's a decisive phase. The point is, when it comes to the question how the war could end, we still don't know the Russian objectives. I have heard at least 3 narratives. The first one was traditional security concerns, which we discussed for years in the context of arms control negotiations. And it's about NATO expansion, or the potential stationing areas for troops and missiles. This is somewhat classical, that one can really negotiate. And that is reflected in the draft treaties of the 17th of December last year. Then we heard another narrative, which is an imperial one, that denies the Ukrainian identity, the Ukrainian homogeneity, etc., and looks for historical Russian lands taking...
So clearly that has to be, clearly those demands have to be scaled down.
And the third one we just heard, taking out an aggressive regime. I ask, who is attacking whom?
Exactly.
We don't know the objective yet, and it will be decided, as you said, on the battlefield.
I'm sorry to jump on you there, Wolfgang Richter, but we have a limited amount of time. Louise Jones, I mean, for you, what way could this end, and could it get to a settlement fairly soon, or are we looking at years here?
I think we've got a way to run, and, you know, they keep coming up with these very nebulous aims, or let's talk about denazifying, you know, they... Famous quote about the Roman Empire, they made a desert and called it peace. Well, the Russians are just making a desert of southeast Ukraine and the Donbass and saying it's denazified. You know, their complaints about the regime, the government of President Zelensky, you know, there's no way that Russia has got the capability to affect the government of Ukraine now. All that's going to happen is a very long, drawn-out battle. We're going to lose thousands more Russian lives. You know, I don't know if either the gentlemen up there have got children, if they've been sent to fight in the Donbass. I'm very certain that President Putin has not sent any of his children to go and die in the Donbass.
And one thing's for certain, isn't it, about any settlement, that it's Ukraine's call. You know, whatever the accusations have been about President Zelensky changing what he will accept, well, that's up to them. They're the ones doing the fighting.
Yeah, absolutely. And President Zelensky has been very clear he doesn't want to give up a single inch of Ukrainian soil. So, you know, the Russians are just going to have to accept that, because they certainly don't have the powers or the forces to be able to change that over the long run. You know, with the support that NATO is now stepping up, unified NATO, really Russia is just going to have to accept the inevitable coming their way.
I'm afraid we're out of time. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks to all my guests, to Sergei Markov and Dmitry Babich in Moscow, Wolfgang Richter in Berlin, and of course Louise Jones here with me in Westminster. And you are watching Sky News Tonight. Coming up at 8 o'clock, the United Nations Secretary-General has called for a ceasefire in Ukraine as soon as possible, as he's visited President Putin in Moscow and called for that ceasefire to evacuate civilians from the besieged port city of Mariupol.